Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks again. Really appreciate you joining us today. And I think we have a really interesting topic on You've Been Framed, using frameworks and standards to improve and defend your security program. Today we'll be going over the different standards, looking at the pros and cons. And there's been actually quite a few advances made in the standards recently, a lot of changes. So it'll be interesting to see in which one is best for your organization. A little bit about, again, my name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Practice Development. A little bit about Trusted Sec and our mission. Really the goal of what we're trying to do is change the security industry for the better. So we're doing a lot of webinars, a lot of talking to folks. We speak a lot. We'll have one of our main speakers here with us today. And we give a lot of free tools out, etc. So always avail yourself of the information that we have on our website. There's a lot there for you to consume. The way that we go about security is a little bit different than other organizations. We use senior level consultants, and you'll see that in the work product that we give, the level of consulting that you receive from us. We really want to give you the best product available out there. And we use all that information and research to really bring that into your risk management program and help you reduce risk. That's the name of the game. And really, if you're not at the cutting edge, you're not going to be getting the best product. You're going to be missing information. And we've really seen that as a struggle pickup recently. And then lastly, with the things that we do, we always try and be a partner and really truly a friend. You can feel free to call us anytime. If you have questions, we have multiple experts, so we'll always get you the right answer when you're ready, or we're always willing to take that extra time to spend with you. We do put, again, research at the forefront, and we really believe that, and we put a tremendous amount of effort into that in the last couple of years, simply because things have gotten more complicated, both on the offensive and the defensive side as well. The more mature organizations are putting in a lot of tools that have been protecting them pretty well from some of the regular run-of-the-mill type of penetration tests. So we really stepped it up in the last couple of years with our adversarial emulation threat and research team. And again, they work directly with our consultants, both the technical ones as well as the advisory, and we'll talk about remediation in a second, to bring that knowledge. And so when we're giving you recommendations, we have the latest and greatest coming to you to bear. A few of our services, obviously as a consulting organization, we do penetration testing. Red and blue teams, purple teams have gotten a lot of play lately. Today we'll be talking a lot about the frameworks and frameworks alignment and standards. But one of the things I really want to just announce or touch on is our remediation services, which is new. We've gotten so many questions and interest in us helping with tactical projects, getting things done. When we set up the strategy for organizations or help them understand their gaps, what are those things that you just need an expert for a short period of time, or someone to oversee a particular project. So that's really gained a lot of steam and something that we're looking forward to continue to roll out. So first, I want to introduce Alex Hamerstone. I've known Alex for a while, and Alex, maybe let you, and these pictures are pretty good. We wanted to kind of show a little bit of our personality, since these are on the website. That picture really accurately reflects what Alex is like.
So that's an absolutely horrible picture. So thank you everyone for joining. So my name is Alex Hamerstone, and I've been with Trusted Sec about 6 years now. Prior to that, I worked at a software company, and before that, I was in consulting at a different security company. And so I work with organizations of all sizes, all verticals, all over the world. And I think one of the things that I always like to say is that I'm certainly not smarter than anybody else, but I've seen so many different environments and so many different ways that organizations are implementing and running security programs, so that I oftentimes am able to, share experience of things that I've already seen, or the way other people have dealt with an issue, or some of the ways that we've helped them through things or helped them build programs. And I spend most of my time, again, on the program side, not on the hacking side. So, working with organizations to assess and build information security programs.
And again, my name is Stephen Marshowitz. I'm the Director of Practice Development here at Trusted Sec. I've been in IT and security for several years now. Done various things with Cisco and another consulting firm before that. One of the things that I've really been tasked with and try and bring a lot to is integrating all of the different technologies and groups together to provide a great product for our clients. So that's a little bit about me. And today we started really with what was the purpose of the webinar, and really we wanted to get past that unhelpful advice, which we've probably all gotten, which is which one should I choose, which framework should I look at? And today we'll really be focusing mainly on 3, but there's certainly other ones out there, but those are the most prevalent and popular ones we see. But everyone says, it all depends. Choose the one that best fits your organization. Doesn't really matter as long as you choose one. So we wanted to really try and help address those types of issues because, when we get those types of answers, it doesn't really help us much.
And I think too, choose the correct standard or framework that best suits your organization is certainly great advice. It's just that it's oftentimes not backed up with understanding how to do that, or how to really understand what's going to best fit. And the absence of specific regulatory requirements, oftentimes looking at the organization and figuring out what's going to line up best and make things work best is not always as easy as it seems.
And Alex, even with these frameworks, with those organizations that are just getting started, we have our own methodology. Why did you kind of go off the path and create something even a little bit different than the typical frameworks out there?
Sure, and that's a great question because there's so many out there. Why do you need another one? But from our standpoint, it's taking as much as it's an overused term, kind of the best practices that work for most organizations. One of the challenges is that a lot of these frameworks, even when they're used in a general way, were oftentimes designed for certain types of organizations or certain sizes or criticalities. And for us, it's really, for a company that's getting started, it can be so overwhelming to look at all the different security controls that are out there and all the things that you could be doing. There are always a million things that everybody could be doing, but how do we prioritize what's most important? And with everything, in security so interdependent on other things, even if you're firing on all cylinders in one area, oftentimes it's challenging because you may be missing things in other spots. Certain areas of the program may not function well because you're missing some other stuff. So giving a really good holistic view of the information security program in general is generally how we like to start.
So where do these frameworks really help? When we see this, we obviously know that they're there for a reason. But are they really helping us support regulatory compliance? Sometimes we hear, you can be secure. If you're secure, you're compliant. But if you're compliant, that doesn't necessarily make you secure. Do you see the frameworks really helping with regulatory compliance from what you've seen?
So absolutely. And the fact of the matter is, even if you throw something out there, like a lot of people like to talk about PCI and it as a standard. But in my experience, a lot of organizations, in the absence of being required to comply with that, they really wouldn't do much. And so it certainly is helpful from that standpoint. Absolutely having something to be able to look at and measure from a control standpoint can be extremely valuable. It helps people, kind of put guardrails around their program and understand, what they need to be looking at in order to support compliance. We've certainly seen, in the news, a number of, organizations that have challenges, whether they're fines or, not being able to do business with other companies because they're not meeting certain requirements. So it's very important.
What about this last one with, using a framework to discuss security with executives and the board? We have heard that that's happening, but, where do you really see that, as being successful or not?
So it's interesting. I am fortunate in that I'm able to do a lot of board presentations. And so I spend a lot of time, speaking to boards at larger companies about their information security programs and, risk-based security and things like that. And, oftentimes what happens is, for us, we're very myopic in this industry, and we think that everyone, thinks about information security all the time. When in fact, although it may be in the news all the time or maybe a topic all the time, it's not necessarily the driver for all the business decisions or things like that. And with executives, in my experience, they oftentimes want to be able to see a dashboard. They want to be able to see something visual that shows progress, that has some kind of measurable goals. And so being able to have some kind of framework, with goals laid out and how you're meeting them and, maybe where you are with each of the controls or each of the requirements can be extremely helpful, not just to show progress, but to help them to see, what some of the goals are.
Great. So we're going to go a little bit into, how does it help achieve your organizational goals? And really, can you make a case? Can you honestly make a case when you're using a framework NIST or CIS or ISO, that it reduces cost? I mean, have you seen people making a case for these using a framework, that you're improving better spending? I'm not so sure that you can do that. Better ROI, increased compliance, you can definitely say if you're doing general controls across. If we have more controls, that means we've reduced risk. I mean,
well, in this industry, everyone loves to argue, right? Is always looking to debate things, but cost is oftentimes, obviously that's a measurable thing. It's quantitative. And so being able to reduce, the cost of fines, is certainly an issue or things that may come up like that. But when you look at it, being able to operate the program from a defined framework, which can lead to a roadmap, allows you to have a plan. Because without a plan and just spending willy-nilly and, kind of throwing tools in here and there or having initiatives that may not support each other or double initiatives or things like that, in the way that a framework or standard can help you define a roadmap, it can certainly help increase efficiency and reduce cost. Obviously increased compliance should really speak for itself. Reduce risk. I know there's a lot of talk in the industry about, cyber risk. And it's something that, in my experience, risk is very defined in certain industries like finance and insurance, have, very defined enterprise risk, and cyber is still, doesn't have a lot of history, and there's so much nuance to it that it's certainly a challenge. And being able to show reduced risk can be difficult, especially because many organizations haven't decided how they're going to measure risk. And so without being able to measure something or having very defined parameters around how you're measuring it, it's very difficult to show progress.
But even with insurance companies, I mean, they're not typically giving discounts, and they might say they are if you have a secure program or if you're certified or what have you. Usually, a lot of times, the assessments or the reviews that they send out to help guide how they underwrite, they're really looking, are you compliant? And that's about it. Are you PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant? And that's about all they can do.
Well, and I think we could certainly get down the road when it comes to cyber insurance, but I think I'm with Warren Buffett when he came out recently and said it's not something he would want to, have to underwrite because there's just so much to it. There's so much nuance. And if you look at other types of insurance, if you take a certain population of, males that are of a certain weight and a certain age that don't smoke, you have a pretty good idea how many are going to, pass away in a certain year. And you can price your insurance products, based on that. Whereas, with cyber, it's a much different, and there's a lot more factors that go into it, and it's much more challenging. There's kind of a lack of the history. So certainly something to think about.
And on this last one, the supporting information, it's interesting on that one because even though that's still debatable, we still actually don't see a ton of people making that case. Cisco did this study a couple of years ago that showed that 70% of the executives, and they interviewed over 1,000 people or so, said that concerns over cybersecurity are impeding their innovation in their organizations because they're afraid to take on something new or different or, change what's going on. So, it does support innovation in that way. And some of them even halted mission critical initiatives just because of the security was so big. So you can make some general cases with frameworks, but they typically don't come across exactly as the same as risk does or quantifying things. Well, but there are some arguments that can be made.
And I think when it comes to supporting innovation, I'm a consultant, so I can argue either way, depending on, what the situation is. But the fact of the matter is, having defined parameters and rules and methodologies can allow innovation in the sense of, you have to really know the rules before you can effectively break them. But also, giving people kind of, a good idea of, how they need to go about processes allows them to, add new things in there in a repeatable way. But I think, to be honest with you, what I hear more often when I talk to developers or people that are, looking to innovate in the business, they oftentimes feel hamstrung by, compliance concerns or rules and regulations. So.
Yeah, and moving into our next, the biggest complaints, definitely we hear that the frameworks are too complex. There's just too many controls. It's taking them too long to learn. Again, even just implementing them is very, very challenging for a lot of organizations. But all of it, and all of it doesn't always apply. A lot of them will move into different things that, you quite frankly can't do, particularly in even some of the earlier ones. And so, there are a lot of complaints about the frameworks that we hear and reasons why people are not using them.
Well, I think a challenge with that too is just because a lot of them attempt to be all things to all people. And so when you look at some of these and what they're designed for, some feel like they're designed for large organizations with some maturity. Some feel like they're maybe, designed for smaller companies or different things. So that's one of the challenges too, is that there are just so many of them that, are very broad and general. And a lot of times, looking at these, a lot of people, like to be high achievers, right? So they want to be 100% in every area. And that might not make sense, from a risk perspective. You're not going to spend $1,000 to protect $10. And so in certain areas, you may not, want to meet them completely. And you may have very good compensating controls or very good reasons for not wanting to meet them. But, having a program allows you to understand that and make informed decisions about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do.
Yeah, and I still think that, if you can adhere to a framework, it's still the best starting point. Gives you a baseline and somewhere to go off of. But we do hear a lot of complaints, and there are a lot of organizations still really not embracing them. So how often do you have to do the assessments? How do you, like from us as an assessment firm, how often should we be coming in? How often should the organization be doing it themselves? Why can't they just, always do it themselves?
So that's a lot of questions and a lot of different answers. So, it really depends. Some frameworks and standards have defined assessment periods, where you need to either self-assess or work with a third party to do it. Obviously one of the things that we're hearing more about and that we push forever is, continual assessments. If you only check something once a year, you're not necessarily looking to see if you have a progress in it. And so for me, I'm a big fan of roadmaps and having defined goals and landmarks, when implementing these things. But really, a lot of these can be driven by your own policies. So if you're requiring that you go out and perform an assessment quarterly of, your IAM or whatever it may be, obviously that's when it needs to be done. But really, continual assessment is becoming the name of the game. But really, for any organization, I think at least annually or every other year, making sure that you're kind of coming in and taking a look at the overall program, how it's operating. The world changes so quickly, especially with what we're doing. If you look at how different assessments are versus 10 years ago, I know Dave, who we work with, talks a lot about, 10 years ago when we were doing this, you would see organizations that were very much building walls around everything and wanting to keep everything out. But now it's data, share your data with everyone. You have to be able to work with this data and everyone's got to have access to it and you got to send it everywhere. And so, all these changes and, things like the cloud and, whatever buzzword, AI or IoT or everything's just so different. And so if you're not constantly assessing, and then you're kind of relying on the way things used to be when things are very different, you need to keep up.
And then we always get the question of, what shouldn't I just start, doing some things? Why should I assess first?
Well, that's like anything. And, I always get in trouble for telling too many stories, but I remember, going into a friend's house 15 years ago and they had the most beautiful stove I'd ever seen. It was some European stove and it's probably a $10,000 stove. And this was back when a brand new Jeep Wrangler cost 15 because, I'm older than I like to admit. But, just looking at that and just taking something and just sticking it in there and the rest of the kitchen looked terrible, right? It hadn't been updated in 30 years and it was dirty and whatever else. And so you have to have a plan, with anything. And so just taking things and kind of, doing certain things without any kind of plan oftentimes leads to wasted effort. And a lot of times you end up doing things that you really didn't need to do, or you end up doing double work or spending money on things you didn't need, or you don't go out and buy roof tiles, for a house before you even dug the basement. So it's just looking at it and looking at the whole, not just the security program, but the environment. So understanding what data you have, understanding, the importance of that data, who's accessing it, how do you need to share it, how's it used in commerce, what is the impact if you lost it or lost certain systems. So just really understanding your whole environment and the security program and then rolling into making decisions.
It also really helps baselining. So especially if you're new coming into a program or a new company, or even if you're just taking on a new role, one of the things you really want to do is make sure that you're showing progress, because at the end of the year, there's always problems in security. So at the end of the year, someone will say, well, what have you done? And you're like, well, did a lot of stuff. We had a lot of projects. Well, are we any better? Or how much progress did you make against what? How can you show that you made some progress? So it does help with that as well.
And what's the thing with IT? It's, it's, hey, everything works. What do you do all day? Versus, hey, nothing's working. What do you do all day? Right. Like, so it's, so being able to have defined goals and a defined program that you can work against and work towards is certainly helpful.
So the next, getting background information is program versus risk. We hear those terms used interchangeably quite often. What what are you seeing, or does it make that big of a difference to have these two different terms out there that people are interchanging, using interchangeably?
So here's the fact of the matter is, in information security, one of the issues that we deal with is just, what people call things. And so, you see it with pen testing. You see a lot of people that, will say they want a pen test, but what they're looking for is a vulnerability scan, or, you have red teaming, you have other things. Well, that's no different on the GRC and advisory side. And the number of times we very commonly will get a request for a risk assessment. Hey, I'm looking for a risk assessment. And to us, people in the industry, kind of compliance nerds, risk assessment has an academic definition. And also a lot of different, frameworks and standards and regulatory requirements have their own definition for a risk assessment. And so, but what it often means when someone calls and says, I'm looking for a risk assessment, they're looking for a program or a controls assessment. So one of the things is just, making sure that we're all using the same language. Because if we haven't agreed on what the very term we're discussing means, it's almost impossible to have a conversation that provides value.
And even in this little, simple equation here, really the things in the programs, we're really looking at the countermeasures, what you have in place, the controls in place, and some of the process and maturity within that. But obviously, we're not looking at threats, we're not looking at vulnerabilities, and we're not looking at the impact. So they're clearly not risk assessments, but they can serve as a proxy for risk. So generally, if you're pretty immature or non-existent in a lot of controls, you're going to say we're more than likely than not have a high risk profile. So they don't address it directly, but you can use that as some way to show that you're a low risk or high risk. Not the ideal way to do it, but still a lot of organizations are doing that. And oddly enough, we're really actually not even seeing risk assessments seem like they were bigger a couple of years ago, and people have tailored off on them recently. Any thoughts?
I think one of the challenges too is, if you look at some of these larger organizations or in certain verticals, again, risk has a very different term, and they have an enterprise risk management function. And, they have, tons of people, they have outside consultants working on it, they have teams working on it. And then when it comes to cyber risk, which is a huge business risk, they maybe have one or two people devoted to it and don't necessarily have great definitions. So I think that's one of the things that we're going to continue to see. I don't want to get too off topic and pontificate, but I think one of the things that we're going to continue to see is cyber risk being seen more and more as a business risk and included as such and considered as such.
All right, very good. Well, let's get into some of the frameworks and standards now, going into it. So let's start off with ISO 27000 series. And, we get these two a lot of times confused with 27001 and 27002. But 27001 is, again, the information management system. It's the system and the program and the processes around the controls. And 27002 is simply the catalog of the controls, catalog of things that you can do that may be managed. Now, again, even ISO says that you don't have to use the 27002 controls. You can use some other control framework or some control basis, but generally that's the difference. And most organizations are looking for assessments. When they say assessments, or looking for the background from us, or looking for controls in and around 27002. But one of the questions is, why is Annex A versus 27002? What's the difference? So 27001 has an Annex A that has a list of controls. Why don't they just refer to 27002?
Sure. Well, I think it's probably a document design issue is why it's in there that way. But 27002 is going to have larger descriptions of the Annex A controls. It's going to be pretty much the same controls, so that the Annex A is going to tell you what the goals are. But 27002, when it lists those controls, are going to talk about how to implement them in a lot more detail.
So, the ISO has really been the standard bearer for frameworks. I mean, it was, I don't know if the first, but definitely the most widely adopted one across the world and earliest. So it's still pretty prevalent within the organization. And I know that, we talked about this Plan, Do, Check Act, and it's not required anymore, you had said, but it still looks like that's the process that they're following to set up the program. What is your plan? Now, we have talked, several times over the years of most organizations are checking first. because they don't know what to plan for. They don't know what they don't know. But this system really does, it's the foundation of pretty much everything quality control, all of ISO, and any Six Sigma, et cetera. It just really boiled down to these things. So similar like we had before, the assess, it's and then you have to go back, set up your plans, et cetera. It's very similar. But again, they took it out. Any thoughts on why they took this out of 20, or didn't, not that they took it out, but didn't make it mandatory?
So it's funny when the new version of ISO came out and they dumped the PDCA. It was certainly surprising to people that hadn't been involved kind of in the decisions. And just to tell you what kind of people I associate with, there was actually a lot of talk about it, and it's something that we actually discussed extensively, I think back in 2013. So, I think it's just a different way of doing it. It's something, if you look at organizations, use ISO for other stuff as well, manufacturing and quality control and things like that. And it had been, a part of that as well. I think I was surprised to see it come out. It's certainly, I think it's a great methodology in general, kind of, even if you don't, jump on the P, you can jump on in the C or the A or, whatever other letters in the PDCA, and kind of jump into the process there.
So when you go into if you go into the next area on getting to certification or registration, I guess they're used interchangeably. Pretty much it's just they're just looking for, in other words, into measuring yourself against this ISO standard. It's either you have it or you don't, or it's a major nonconformity, meaning it has a direct effect on your program, or minor means an indirect effect. Maybe a policy is missing or what have you. But generally, we get, there's only a couple of certifying bodies, but we get a lot of pre-audit questions.
So I think the issue there is when you look at ISO is a lot of people, use it to be aligned to it. So they're never looking, or they're never planning to go get the certification or the registration. But they want to use ISO to drive their program and as a foundation. And it works great like that. It's a good way to, have a program. One of the issues with ISO that, you hear is that, these nonconformities sometimes can, be born of documentation issues or things that may feel minor. So you're spending more time on documentation and a lot of the process stuff and not out, doing the security activities that, you might want to be spending more time on. I guess it really depends on your view of, what you want your program to be and how you want it to be driven.
So, but if you're looking to go for certification, what you're saying is the assessment's going to be, in essence, different than what you would do if someone says, I want to have a general assessment, but using ISO as a baseline.
Sure. And if you're looking at, because again, the number of organizations that I talk to that want to be, aligned to ISO and use it as a driver and not necessarily be certified. So it's obviously a different process. If you're only looking to be aligned and, use the spirit and the elements of ISO to drive the program, you can be obviously less veracity in some of that documentation and some other reviews and things like that. But again, I think that it's funny because in the past few months, seeing more of an uptick in organizations that are looking to go down the certification path. And it's really interesting to me because traditionally, organizations were very interested in ISO when they were operating internationally. Or if they're a manufacturer that's, already familiar with the other ISO standards, they speak the language and they're comfortable with it. And, lately, we've been seeing a lot more people move towards the NIST Cyber Security Framework, partially because it's free, and being able to use that. So it's probably not interesting to most people, but it fascinates me just the ebbs and flows of, what standards and what frameworks are popular at what time, either for discussion or for implementation.
Yeah, because you really haven't seen as much change in ISO as the other ones. The other ones have made drastic changes over the last 5 years, or some even within the last year and a half or 2 years.
Well, and keeping in mind that we're sitting here in beautiful, rainy Cleveland, Ohio. So, obviously, sitting in the United States, it's going to be a different view, in the EU and a lot of the other parts of the world. Certainly ISO has continued to, be the standard and something that people are using. I think that it's about, maybe it was 8 or 9 years ago, there was a huge flurry with, moving towards ISO, and then it seemed to just kind of die out.
And now it's back. So if you're not going for certification, you basically then, you're not looking for if you're conforming or not conforming. So we're still using the capability maturity model. We still see a lot of organizations gravitate towards this. It's helpful when ISO is used as the guideline, but even for other standards, we're still seeing this CMM or CMMI integration. And we build off of that, and we define the program maturity as that view of all those things coming together. So processes, procedures, policies, controls, how are they working? And we use generally ISO has, CMM has a 1 to 5 scale. We use a 0 because sometimes organizations have, there's no security controls whatsoever in place. So we add a 0 in there. But generally, organizations like it. It's well known. People have been using it for years now. They can understand the basic initial maturity versus if you're able to repeat a process, if you can manage it, and then if you're optimizing it. So people seem to understand that and know that they're generally looking to get to a defined state, a level 3 or a managed state. Optimizing is when you have that continuous improvement. And you're really on top of your game. We still just don't see that many organizations even trying to achieve that. But it is there, and we use it still pretty prevalently, and really are even requested to use it for other systems.
And for me, I'm a big fan of scales, because when it comes to either a yes or a no, or in place or not in place, or anything that's binary like that, I liken it to whether you have never started school, or whether you're 1 credit away from a degree. You don't have a degree, right? So yes or no. But there's a difference, in the progress that's been made and how close you are to getting there, or really anything like that. So I think if you're just looking at something binary of a yes or a no, or in place and not in place, without having context around that and how close you may be and what the actual state is. And again, because if you're not looking to go for the certification route, and you're looking for alignment, it's important to know how far along you are. So it may not matter as much that it's a no if you're at 95%.
Mm-hmm. All right, so capturing all that, we got the background, trying to avoid our, not helpful advice. When is this the best framework to use?
Well, so there are a lot of answers to that, right? But the simplest one is when someone says you have to. Either because it's the customer telling you that you need to, or some other reason like that. Another one is it works great if you're operating internationally and want to be able to show, whether you're working with people in the EU or the US or wherever it may be. Also, how many people spend time filling out vendor questionnaires, describing the security of your organization? We all do, right? And so oftentimes if you're able to show that you're, certified or registered with ISO 27001, people will accept that rather than, going through these constant vendor assessments. One of the cons is it is, difficult to do.
Well, even if you're not going for certification, it's difficult.
Well, so I guess that depends. It's kind of like how far do you want to get? Like how good do you want to be at it? So, if you are going for certification, though, there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of process changes. And for organizations that, are not used to defined processes and aren't used to documentation, it can be a real change.
Yeah, I think that is, you can certify it too. I think that's one of the things, that some of the other frameworks don't have. There's no certification for them. So if there is, a need for that, again, as you said, you're trying to demonstrate credibility or, can create a market differentiation. Sometimes, again, the organizations don't, if it's a requirement that you have to be ISO compliant or certified. So, sometimes it will create a market differentiation. And that's generally where we're seeing it going. We've seen, and we'll talk about the other ones, but seen actually a move away from this as the baseline for a lot of organizations. So again, unless you're really looking at it for those specific things, probably not ideal for you. Although, again, it's still standard and, there's pros and cons to it. But generally that's, in essence, we would say is we're not seeing as many organizations use that recently.
And I think one thing to point out, too, is of the ones we're discussing, it's the one that you can frame. It's the one that, has something that, as you mentioned, is a certification that you can print out and, put up on the wall.
So the next one we're going to talk about is the NIST Cyber Security Framework. And And really, this is, NIST estimates that currently 30% of the private sector is using NIST, so 30%. And they think that, I went to the NIST Cyber Security Conference, they think that it's expected to grow to 50% by 2020, and that's typically in the U.S. But even at that conference, there were several people international that are using this. When we do assessments around the cybersecurity framework, and the things that probably are like about it, it's got a common taxonomy and mechanisms. It does follow kind of a logical process where you have to identify what you have, know what you have at least, do your best to protect it. When you can't protect it, obviously you have to detect, figure out what's happening, and then be able to respond, and then if there's an incident, recover from it. So it's a pretty logical process that lays out that people seem to understand pretty well.
And I could jump back. I know that they kind of quote that 30 and 50% statistic, but I would assume that would have to mean of people that are choosing to use a framework or a standard to guide their program, that percent may be using it. Because if you look at the entire private sector and the percent that don't really have any security program, any security plan, and how you define organizations, there's a like the vape shop down the street from our office, or something like that would be part of the private sector, but I can tell you they don't have a security framework, right? So kind of looking at it that way, but certainly just from our experience and the calls that we get, the CSF has just really been taking off in the past couple of years. There was some rumblings in the news about possibly making it a requirement, as the government kind of moves towards how they're going to regulate cybersecurity and those kind of things. So something to keep on the radar there too as well.
So but in this, again, starting at that identify, and I know you talk about it a lot, and a couple in the other framework that we'll talk about, the CIS has that asset management first. Identify. Is that really realistic for organizations, or when you're assessing them in so many ways? What are you seeing? Where are you seeing them strengths and weaknesses? Along this sort of dynamic or this path.
Well, it's identification is challenging. Inventories are challenging, and when I walk into an organization and I'll ask about inventories, oftentimes I'm in a conference room and they'll pick up their the conference room phone and show me the asset tag, and that's not really necessarily what we mean when we talk about inventories. It's more, understanding, what exactly is, in your environment, on your network, and, what data you have and all these other things, so that we really understand not just the assets and the data assets and how they're used, but also, whether you've, well identified, what the threats are to your organization, what your risk or what your risk is, and things like that. And it really is something that a lot of organizations struggle with. The example I like to use, if you woke up one morning and you saw that there was a very specific, end of the world vulnerability that affected a certain version of a certain, program on a certain system, would you even know if you had that? And if you did know if you had it, would you know where it is and, what data you have on it and what it's connected to and all those things? So it really is essential. How can you go out and put controls in place, or how can you protect what you don't know if you don't know you have it? And even if you're talking about, say, vulnerability management, hey, our vulnerability management is working great. Well, do you know what you have? Well, not really. Well, so then how do you know it's working great? So it really is kind of the foundational control in a lot of ways.
Would you say this is now the most popular from what you've seen, or what about, let's put it another way, from mature organizations, have they moved to this standard more so than ISO?
So that's a tough question, always, because the information that I have is oftentimes self-selecting, in the sense of, organizations that are reaching out to someone like us already have security on their radar. It's already something that they're thinking about. And so just, temper it with that. But I would certainly say, to kind of hedge my answer, is that we've seen a huge uptick in this. More and more people are interested in it and want to use it as a base for the program.
So moving on to how they define, I guess, progress. So they see the NIST, the CSF tiers as that degree of rigor or sophistication in your risk management practices. And so they see it as a set of common target outcomes versus maturity. And they purposely avoid the term maturity. The rationale being that the tiers are more focused on reducing cyber risk and including the benefits of a cost benefit process. So the idea really is to establish targets, and they have the 4 tiers: partial, it's a partial more about your program, partial program, risk informed program, repeatable, and adaptive. And just as an example, going into the background, what a partial is, and they break it down into those three areas: risk management process. Again, how mature are you? Even though they don't use that word, how well is it managed in an ad hoc way or a more formal way, risk-informed way, etc. How well is it integrated? And what's interesting, I think, about the tiers is that typically, and we'll talk about risk in a second, but typically you'll see the big, as you mentioned earlier, the enterprise risk management being the lead dog versus the security, or within the security framework, using a risk management term within the security program, because again, it's not a risk program, it's a security program. It's not a risk-based program, even though, again, as we touched on before. And then lastly, what's kind of interesting is this external participation. How well are you collaborating with other entities? That's something that with supply chain, et cetera, it's getting a lot more credibility and a lot more interest from organizations. So really we see a lot of folks moving to it. It has a lot of defined things. It's made it a lot simpler. But when, in your opinion, is this now the best framework to use? And why do you think it's gained so much traction?
There's probably a lot of reasons it's gained traction. One of which is it's free. If you want the ISO standard, you're gonna go pay for it. And so this is freely available. It's your tax dollars at work. And it really has been a good way for organizations to kind of look at the different elements of a security program and things that they should be doing and things they should be moving towards. And it's been very valuable in that way. It's something that, it's one of those things. And then the more people that start using it, of course, the more blogs that are written about it, the more people are talking about how they implemented it. And so the more information and advice that's available for people that are looking to go down this route. One of the things is I'm a huge fan of really a lot of what NIST does. They put out a lot of great standards and frameworks and things like that. There's even been certain direction they've been giving lately, for small and medium-sized businesses. Because again, one of the challenges with this one is, because it's written, largely, at the start for critical infrastructure.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, if you're critical infrastructure, you're going to have very different threats and a very different environment and needs. And then, let's say like a local, print shop that prints T-shirts or something like that. So one of the challenges is always, because these cover so much and they're so extensive, they may not be right for smaller organizations or less mature organizations, or, places without, really the budget to implement and, assess these things.
And I think one of the other positives is we talked about the risk management is sort of built into it, again, as a proxy. So it has some common terminology that executives will understand. Although, again, we're still seeing the even with the cybersecurity framework, they're using the controls, but they're still using maturity as the measure of success. So, but I would say this is probably still the most popular, in just a short period of time. It's only been a few years since it's come out, and just in that short period of time, it's probably the most popular framework that we see, probably far and away.
Yeah, for what we're seeing, and again, to temper it with that, with what we see.
So generally that might be the great place to start. There's a lot of common patterns that have emerged, and as you said, there's so much government documentation behind it. So I just wanted to touch on the difference between the cybersecurity framework and the NIST 800-53. So when would you use this 800-53 versus the CSF, and what was the purpose of it?
Well, and so to back up even, just when it comes to, kind of the industry is, oftentimes people will say, hey, I want a NIST assessment. And, the thing is, NIST is an organization. And so they put out everything from, standards for taxi cab meters to IT and to security. And so they certainly have a number of, things that are out there. So like NIST 866 is, what you would use, around HIPAA, and then, NIST 800-171 around controlled and classified information and things like that. NIST 853 is something that, obviously, organizations use when they need to, for compliance purposes. But it also has been adopted, believe it or not, by a lot of organizations that are just looking for a basic, that's probably the wrong word for 53, but, kind of a good basic list of controls and something that they can kind of compare their program against and their current controls against. And again, because it's free, to go out and you can go out
Yeah.
and download it right now, and has a lot of detail. It's certainly something that people like to look at and compare their program to.
But since it's on this, impact of your systems, obviously generally the government has, they start with data classification. So is that, is it really realistic that organizations, or how much have, we seen that organizations have baselined their data based on, or systems based on low or moderate or high impact?
Well, so I would just say that an organization that's advanced enough to, be trying to implement, the high impact controls is probably one that understands when those are appropriate. So I don't think it's something that, somebody with some small business is going to say, hey, we've heard of this 853 thing. Let's go out and, try to implement these, the high impact controls. So, obviously it really depends on the situation.
Great. So moving on to the CIS Top 20, Center for Internet Security Top 20. This organization, people have used it for their system baselines, but they have this list of controls, and the way that they've laid them out, these 20 are the top ones, and again, they've saying the basics. So these basic ones, and I'll ask again, one of the biggest things we haven't, they see these as cyber hygiene, if you will, the basic things you must do, those first 6 to control the foundation for your defense. But again, we get into that asset inventory, both software and hardware assets first. And every organization that I've talked to, this is the stopping point. They can't even get past number 1 or 2. So, from what you've seen, is it a regular way of, actually rolling this out? Because, if you can't get through the first 1 or 2, how are you going to make it to the rest?
Well, so it's interesting because, in my experience, and the longer I do this, the more, being out in the world and just seeing that a lot of organizations just aren't doing a whole lot from a programmatic security perspective. And so, a lot of these things are challenging. And, people are always looking for and, kind of trying to find a place to start, a place to get a foothold with a program. And what are the basic things they should be doing to start? And, even here, I know that, I don't know really of many organizations that are doing all of these things well, or have them all documented and all of them, running as part of their program. So it certainly is a challenge. I think that, one of the things that we hear most often is, where do I start? Even for organizations that, may have, some elements of a security program in place, but are looking to grow that, just trying to figure out where do they even start is such a challenge. How do you prioritize?
And just, moving on to the next one, how they, categorize it. So one of the things I think they've done well is they are listening, and they realize that people, to your point, aren't able to start with all of the controls even in one. So they've come out with this now implementation groups, and if you haven't, I get a little sample later, but if you haven't checked it out, it's definitely worth taking a look at. Because even within those top 20, they have further segmented down to a series of sub-controls. So the first one is just small business, family-owned business, maybe 10, 20 people, whatever, where you're doing self-classifying. You probably don't have an IT person. If you do, it's only one, and he's a generalist. Tier 2 is you do have an IT department, but may or may not have they have technical expertise, but they may or may not have a security dedicated function within it, but gives you that next level set of controls. And obviously the third is going to be for those large organizations that have a security department and people within it. And the way that they've done it, which I think is actually pretty interesting, and these are all pretty new. So like I said, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, just things have changed so much, but you can see, just as an example on the control number 1 on the inventory and hardware assets, they've broken out just even where to start. So if you look at the implementation group 1, you can start now with what are those core basic things on which to begin. So now you can go 1 through 20, but also 1 through 20 with, as an implementation group 1. So even if you're like a group 2, that mid-sized business, you can now have a place to start. So that is kind of what I like about this thing. It seems to be much more moving in the right direction, and it is, as opposed to NIST, giving you some more, basic places to begin, and some tactical sort of steps one by one versus just throwing the whole thing on you at once.
And for me, for the more detail, the better. The more people can be told how to do it, the better. Going back to some of those NIST standards, one of my favorite stories, because consulting is always interesting. I was, working with somebody, and they kept asking me questions from one of the NIST standards, and I was answering them, but I was answering them just by reading the appendix. And I was kind of confused on what was going on. And I was like, well, there's an appendix, right? Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was an appendix that had a lot more detail. So, some of these things do have a lot more detail that people aren't necessarily getting into. But I really do like how they're, giving more information here.
So getting to the when is this the best framework to use and the pros and cons, again, I think we just have not seen too many people use it. That's probably the biggest con. So if you're looking at a community, although they say they have a community of experts from, varied industries and sophistication levels, et cetera, but we just have not seen that many people adopt it. But it does have definitely some strengths. And again, if you're looking to get started, it has some tactical things now that you can get started with. So from that standpoint, probably if you're the less mature, it might be one of the best places to go now.
Well, and I think, to be honest, it's obviously it's been popular in a lot of groups, and the fact of the matter is, I think it's one of those things that people probably feel like they can do it themselves, and so that's probably why we specifically have less call for it as an organization.
Gotcha.
But it's certainly something that it's been around, and it's kind of moved around, kind of who was managing it, but it's continued to grow. I know there was some talk a few years ago, I think it was in California, about pushing these as extra requirements on organizations, and I know that didn't go real far. But a lot of the stuff in there can be very challenging to do. But I think it's a really good way to help see what the priority should be, what should come first, and kind of how to move through these things.
And then moving on to compliance standards, when PCI, HIPAA, SOX, when can they work for a security program, maybe for your holistic security program? Could they make sense, and do they make sense?
So now you're speaking my language, right? When it comes to some of these compliance frameworks, I'm not a lot of fun at parties, but this is like the stuff I love to talk about. But really, again, there are organizations that may have an overall information security program that's running very well, and these compliance frameworks are a subset of that, or something that they manage it as part of that. But to be honest with you, I come across a lot of organizations that this is what drives their security program. So they may not necessarily have an enterprise-wide information security program, but they have a HIPAA compliance program, or they have a program to work to comply with PCI, or whatever it may be. So as much as people like to sometimes denigrate some of the compliance frameworks and standards, the real fact is that a lot of times without these in place, organizations may not do some of the security initiatives. So regardless of how people may feel about them, I think overall, from an industry perspective and just from information security in general, they're extremely helpful.
Great. So getting back to risk, again, using this, risk and program assessment, what are the differences? When you move into, how are they aligning? How are you choosing your controls? How are you deciding what you should be doing, or what level of, maturity or tier or what have you to get to? Each one has its own specific way of building that in. So the cybersecurity framework suggests using NIST risk management framework, and that allows you to select the controls based on impact level. So if you can move to the next slide, impact level. So the challenge there is they're going more. We don't see almost no one using the risk management framework, and again, it's really built on the fact that you have your systems classified already. So that is going to be a challenge on what tier you should get to, and they feel like they built that in, but I definitely see that as a challenge. ISO provides 27005 as a guidance for the risk program. Now, what's interesting about it, though, is still doesn't tell you how to quantify or how to get it, but just what that risk process should look like and how you're choosing your controls, if you will, if that is accurate.
And we're just, I mean, risk management is something that's so important, because, in my view, security has to be risk-based. And that I think as an industry, sometimes one of the reasons that we have challenges is, somebody in security might go running into the boardroom saying the sky is absolutely falling because there's some new vulnerability. But when you look at it from an organizational perspective, it's not something that really affects anything. And so just really understanding, why the different things matter is so essential, and being able to articulate, cyber risk as part of business risk and part of enterprise risk is so essential. So being able to have good risk management frameworks is extremely important, for us to grow, not just as an industry, but also to continue to, help organizations improve.
And then I know we're running out of time, run up against it, but CIS, if you haven't checked it out, they got a nice little risk assessment methodology now. It does use an ordinal scale, 1 to 5, in other words, based on the observed risk that you have, and then 1 to 5 of likelihood, 1 to 5 of impact. But it does, and it shows you an observed risk score. But at least it is a framework or some way to get started. So if you haven't checked that out, it is a little bit simpler than the other two. So a couple last things as we touch on it, just privacy considerations. Where do these frameworks fit in with privacy? Definitely, again, you can't have privacy without security, but the privacy does have different aspects to it. They're looking at different things. For example, why do you have their data? Whose data do you have? Why do you have it? And then how do you notify of the breach? Certain things that we don't really have to.
And where is it? Because again, so much of this stuff swings back to some of the requirements in these standards and frameworks around inventories. Even with GDPR, I've seen a few organizations that have a very good program on paper, but when you press them, they wouldn't know how to implement the program because they don't actually know where their data is and what they actually have. So something to keep in mind there. It's interesting. Privacy is becoming kind of the new hotness, even hearing about something that's more than security in a lot of places. So it's certainly something that's going to continue to grow and change.
And then finally, best practices for success. I think this first one is probably the most critical, is you've got to get a few quick wins. And again, if you're new, baseline it, but you got to get something done. So, hey, here's where we were yesterday, here's where we are today. Get those quick wins. Generally, the way that you're going to show that progress is the regular internal, external assessments. So continue to do those. Again, external assessments on the holistic has, they waiver, like you said, maybe one every year or every other year, something like that. But those external assessments definitely still help get buy-in from the team and the leaders. So we always say, if you can, from an external, they will tell us things that they will never tell you, or they will answer things differently, or we can ask them questions that you can't ask because our jobs are on the line. So that's definitely a big area. Alex talked about earlier, aligning to a risk for the roadmap and project selection and defensibility. There at least has to be some simple process in there, and then train and retrain are some of the best practices that we have. So in summary, hopefully we gave you some good pros and cons of each, enough to make a decision on which one to use, which one to start with. As we went through the pros and cons of each, I think it should become fairly clear as to where to best address and where to start your program with. So I know we don't have too much time. We ran out of time for questions. We will, one of the questions was about SOX and COBIT and COSO and some of the other frameworks. We didn't get into those as much. They're in and around the accounting. There are certain aspects of those, but generally we are not brought in as much around COBIT as IT general controls, et cetera. So we really haven't gotten into that too much. We don't really touch on those types of things. And then one last question: what are the major problems for more mature organizations when we're going through this, and what are the major problems for those larger organizations that might not be as mature?
So there are a myriad of issues, but one of the things with larger organizations is that oftentimes, they're run as either a group of small organizations or business units or things like that. So, how do they interact? Are they things that, how are you going to treat other business units? Are you going to centralize policies? What policies should be centralized? What should be, different per business unit or division? Things like that can be a challenge. Obviously, as you get large, from either an asset perspective or employee perspective, be able to assess all these things and really understand how the whole program is working together are certainly things that are a challenge. Small organizations just having the time and the resources to do some of this stuff. When it comes to some of the compliance things, remember that, if you're dealing with, certain information, whether you have, 50,000 employees or 5 employees, you're oftentimes held to the same standard for, data management and security.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for us today. We will be sharing this recording out on our website, so make sure you check it out there. It's under resources and then webinars. And then really we can, if you ever want to reach out again, if you have any questions, we can dive in further. If you're having challenges with where to start or which one to go to, we can always help with that.
Yeah, and I always say, again, just, we try to be as open and helpful as we can. So feel free to shoot us an email with any specific questions. We won't try to sell you anything. We'll just answer your question, I promise. So, we're always open to that. So please keep that in mind. If you go to trustsec.com, we can, get our information and ask anything you need.
All right. Well, that will wrap it up for today. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. We generally try and mix these up between more advisory, more higher level programmatic, risk-based to technical. So definitely keep an eye out for those. And I want to thank you again, and you guys have a great day.